Welcome. Welcome to the CTN Youth Special Interest Group. We have these webinars approximately every other month where we invite prominent and also early career researchers to present their work on topics that are of significant relevance and interest amongst the audience. And the audience is really a very loosely affiliated group of researchers with the Clinical Trials Network. They range from those that do lab research to prevention, to treatment intervention, implementation, etc., and also technology. So there's a wide range audience. And so today's topic is something we've been all interested in and want to learn more about, is the use of electronic cigarettes and the impact on youth. So our first speaker today is Dr. Suchitra Krishnan-Sarin. She probably needs very little introduction. She's a professor of psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine, where she also leads the Tobacco Center for Regulatory Science. She is the current president of SRNT, just Society for Research of Nicotine and Tobacco. And if you haven't watched it, I recommend you watch her TED Talk that appeared, I think, a couple of years ago, if I'm not mistaken. And here, Dr. Krishnan-Sarin will present an overview. It's really a pretty wide range of topics, helping us understand more about why e-cigarettes are so appealing to youth. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Krishnan-Sarin.
Thank you, Geeta. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I sound like the Verizon guy every time I do that. So anyway, I'm sure we all do. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Geeta, for inviting me. So I'm going to give you a very quick overview, and I'm happy to answer any questions about e-cigarettes and kind of how we got here very briefly, and what is known about the appeal of e-cigarettes in youth. And then I'll hand it over to Scott, who's going to tell you about interventions. So can I share my slides now? Do I have?
Yes, you should be able to do that.
All right. This is always a process, so give me a second here. Okay, and then I have to switch it. How's that? Do you see them now?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Okay, so jumping right into it, as I said, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the use and appeal of e-cigarettes amongst youth. But I thought it was important to kind of put it in context. This may be repetitive because I see a lot of familiar names on the call, people who are involved with the T-course and with SRNT. So you probably heard me talk about this before, so apologies in advance. But essentially, I'd like to bring us back and remind us why this whole, the presence of these products on the market essentially started. It started to, as another way of combating or fighting cigarette consumption and reducing cigarette levels to more than where we are, what we managed to do over the many years. This graph shows you the multiple public health processes and procedures that have been put into place over time that have shown a dramatic decrease in cigarette use over the years. And what I also like to really see is how the Great Depression showed a significant increase in cigarette use, which then came down. And it also makes me wonder about what kind of outcomes we are going to see after this this COVID pandemic in terms of how some of these substance use rates are going to change. I hope not too much, but we'll have to wait and see. Anyway, in short, there have been a number of public health initiatives that have proved effective. However, there were a lot of people who are still smoking cigarettes, and there's always a need for better interventions. We have a lot of interventions which have been shown to be successful, but they don't necessarily work for all smokers. and I'm sure many of you know about these. They include behavioral therapies like CBT, MI, TTM, and a variety of other things, and also pharmacological interventions like the patch, bupropion, and Chantix. And of course, many of these interventions, while they work in adults, have not necessarily been shown to work in youth, which you'll hear about later. Anyway, so in this framework of this public health scenario is when e-cigarettes first arrived on the market. They started appearing on the US market between 2006 and 2009, and there's a whole history behind how they appear on the US market and why they are classified as tobacco products that I will not have time to go into, but I'm happy to answer any questions related to that. But they were developed by a Chinese pharmacist with a very good goal, which means he wanted to provide smokers with an alternative clean form of nicotine to help them quit cigarettes. Unfortunately, that is I shouldn't say unfortunately, that is a great goal. However, as you know, this market has just exponentially grown to be something else over and beyond just a cessation means for smokers. Today, there are over 400 e-cigarette brands on the market. And I also want to mention that e-cigarettes in the US, since are regulated as tobacco products under the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. For those of you who don't know, this act became law on June 22nd, 2009, and it gives the FDA the authority to regulate the manufacture, distribution, marketing, and marketing of tobacco products to protect public health. Now, from 2009 to 2016, the act was not extended to products like e-cigarettes. It's only in 2016 that FDA said, okay, we are going to regulate e-cigarettes now. But even then, even though they had put some procedures into place like reducing access to minors and advertising restrictions, the actual regulation of the product has not yet begun and is not expected to begin probably till sometime next year, because all the companies that have e-cigarettes are required to submit applications to the FDA with the information on the content of their e-cigarettes. And that was due in May of this year, but it was pushed back because of the COVID pandemic to November. And then the FDA has 1 year to review all the applications and make determinations about whether the product can make certain claims and stay on the market. So we are still a little ways away from the product actually being a regulated product. So what does that mean? That means that every product that's on the market today is technically not a legal product. So that's always something to keep in mind. This is a figure that I got from my friend John Samet, who's at the University of Colorado in Denver. He's the dean of the public school. And he basically put together a slide that gives a broad perspective on what the potential benefits and the potential harms of these products could be. I'll walk you quickly through this. The potential benefits of these products are that if they're found to be effective in helping smokers switch or reduce or quit e-cigarettes or cigarettes, then they can reduce the disease risk for these smokers. Cigarettes are known to be associated with a lot of health problems, long-term problems, and the morbidity and mortality associated with the use of these products could be reduced in people who switch to e-cigarettes or even reduce harm in some other way. However, on the other hand, you also have to consider the harms of these products, which include the harms to youth, increased risk of exposure to nicotine. We all know that the teen brain is known to be highly sensitive to the effects of nicotine, and kids get addicted a lot faster. So this is a huge concern, nicotine addiction. And do they then stick with e-cigarettes, or do they move on to other conventional combustible tobacco products or use of other substances? There's a lot of literature that suggests this is true in animals. We need to see if we see the same behavior with human youth. And then when you look at adults, the concern is, are these products really helping adult smokers to quit smoking, or are they just kind of moving them to dual use behaviors where they are not necessarily quitting cigarettes, but they are using both products at the same time and using same amounts of both products at the same time and are not necessarily getting any reduction in harm from switching. There's also the concern of reinitiation of nicotine addiction in former smokers. So these are all concerns that John identified early on. And finally, of course, the concerns with secondhand aerosol exposure. But I'm just presenting this to you to let you know that these are the kind of things the FDA needs to take into consideration when they're approving any product, because they need to take into consideration the potential harms and benefits for public health in general. These are not being regulated like medications where you're looking at benefits to a particular group of people. They are being regulated as tobacco products, and therefore it is harms and benefits to general public that really matters. So now moving on to e-cigarettes, you all know this. These are battery-operated devices. This is what a general e-cigarette looks like. There is a power source, there is an e-liquid container, and then the user basically pushes a button to activate an electronic controller that vaporizes the e-liquid, and then the user inhales the vapor through the mouthpiece. And the e-liquid usually contains solvents like propylene glycol and glycerin in combination with nicotine and a variety of flavor chemicals. These products have really evolved over time. This slide shows you an evolution of the vaping products. They started out with cigarette-like products called cigalikes, then moved on to products called vape pens, which the cigalikes were basically single unit dispensers in the sense that they had the amount of nicotine which is in a full pack of cigarettes, and you used the whole cigalike and then you disposed it off, so you didn't, you could recharge it but you couldn't refill it. The vape pens and all the other products that have come since then are kind of refillable products for the most part. The vape pens have little tanks that you can put e-liquids into. The box mods don't look anything like cigarettes, but they are used a lot by the so-called hobbyists for vape tricks and participating in vaping competitions and producing huge vape clouds. The more recent devices are the nicotine salt devices, which I'll tell you about in a second. The black one you see there next to the box mod is a Juul. And then some other more recent, these are also called pod devices because the e-liquid is actually in a pod, and it's less messy because the pod is inserted with the e-liquid, and then you can, once it's done, you remove it and you reinsert another pod. So these pod-like devices are more recent entrants on the market, but many of these devices vary tremendously in terms of their design features, like what kind of voltage they have, how much puff duration they allow you to, how long the puff duration is, and so on and so forth. And they are very, very flexible, I should say, in many cases in terms of how you can manipulate the device. This is the present market. The only reason I'm showing you the slide is to just highlight for you that this is, when you see something called heat not burn or IQOS, these are not e-cigarettes. This is a very different kind of product, and it's in the bottom right-hand side of my slide. These are products which actually contain tobacco, and they are combusted at lower temperatures, and these are very different than e-cigarettes which contain e-liquids. So just a point to keep in mind. This slide shows you the sales in dollars of e-cigarettes over time, and you can see how the sales have increased significantly. We thought we were getting a little bit of a decrease in sales between 2013 and 2014, but then Juul, the products that everybody talks about now, entered the market, and this led to a huge increase in sales of these products. In fact, that red bar that you see all the way at the end is the Juul brand. Until last year, I think the Juul brand, early last year, the Juul brand actually consisted of about 50% of the e-cigarette market. That may have changed after all the restrictions on flavors that were placed on these products later in the year, but I have not seen any new data on this as yet. And we come to the final, the topic that we are going to discuss today, which is youth use. Why are we concerned about youth use? We are concerned about youth use because this is the 2019 National Youth Tobacco Survey from the CDC, which shows that over 5 million youth in the US are currently using e-cigarettes. This went up dramatically if you look on the top right-hand corner from 3.6 million in 2018. The more important issue is that of these youth, almost 1 million say they use the product daily, and about 1.6 million say that they use the product frequently, which is on 20 or more days in the past month. So this is not just occasional use here and there. These are kids who are using significant numbers of e-cigarettes over the past month. And when these data were obtained, the majority of kids were using the Juul. And of course, the concern is that there are a variety of products available. And what can we do to make these products available for smokers who may want to use them for harm reduction or for quitting cigarettes, if they are indeed beneficial for that purpose? But how do we do that in a way that we reduce the harm that may potentially be that of exposing youth, so many youth, to these products and their contents? And that's the big public health challenge that a lot of us and the FDA are facing today. So keeping that in mind, let me quickly tell you about some research that has been done about what draws youth to e-cigarettes, because I think some of these issues are important to understand, to incorporate into both prevention as well as cessation programs. This is some very early data that we had published from surveys that we do in Connecticut high schools. And this was data collected in fall 2013, which essentially highlighted even back then, kids were very aware of things like good flavors, the fact they could use it anywhere, and so on and so forth. You see a variety of reasons listed here for why kids like to use e-cigarettes, and I'll be coming back to some of these soon. The biggest factor, I think, that really plays a big role in increasing the appeal of these products to kids is the multiple innovative devices. I showed you pictures of these devices earlier. There are so many devices, and there are new ones coming on the market every day. And the kids are attracted to these new devices. They come with new features, new customization, and these are very attractive to youth, because we all know that youth are sensation-seeking, risk-takers. They're looking to make things their own, and these products give them that opportunity because they can manipulate so many things in the product. This just shows you a distribution of how kids are using all different kinds of products. This is data from 2017. We've now found that as new products appear on the market, they report using newer pods as well. And this data shows you that they are not just using single products, but they are using multiple products. So in the sense they're using multiple devices. This pie chart basically shows you the number of different devices that kids are using. And there are very few kids in our high schools who tell us, I'm using a single device. Many of them use multiple devices, or they use their friends, or they use whatever is available. And this is one of the problems with determining use behaviors, by the way, in this population. Speaking to the customization, I told you customization is very appealing to youth. They love the fact that they can customize different flavors, that they have available different flavors. They can customize nicotine levels, the vapor level. They can change the voltage, change the temperature. These are all things that kids report to us as reasons for why they are drawn to these products. The other big reason, and I've alluded to this a couple of times already, is the presence of over 15,000 flavors or more in these e-cigarettes. These are some of the flavors that are available, and you see some of the flavor ads that are available. What I also want to remind people is that these flavors are not benign. Most people think flavors are just benign, are just benign, that they don't constitute anything. But we have to remember that flavors are actually made up of multiple chemicals. Every flavor is made up of chemicals which are listed on the left-hand side. And these are all chemicals which have known toxicity profiles, and they produce inflammation, oxidative stress, and a variety of other things. I'm not going to focus on the toxicity of flavors today, but there is a lot of work going on in our T-course and others to try to understand this aspect of it too. These are some flavors that are used by youth e-cigarette users in high schools. You can see that the fruit flavors top the chart. Candy is also very popular. Interestingly, even back in 2016 or 2017, sorry, when this data was collected, youth knew the difference between mint and menthol, and this is a very important distinction. Only 17.5% of kids said they used menthol, but 62.1% of kids said they used mint, which means some of the regulations the FDA is considering right now of banning flavors except mint and menthol, they probably need to take into consideration the presence of mint too, because the mint is also very popular among kids. This is a paper that we published looking at flavors used by youth and adults. And the point that I want to make here is this paper showed that while both youth and adults use flavors, and these slides will be available to you, so you can certainly look at the numbers later. While both the groups use flavors, what's interesting is that e-cigarette use frequency is related to the total flavors preferred only among youth, but not in adults. So essentially, this is telling us that flavors seem to be a bigger issue in whether in how many e-cigarettes kids use or what their frequency of use is, and not so much in adults. Of course, we need to do a lot more work in this area, but this is just an initial indicator that flavors may be preferably altering youth use. We have also shown that flavors, like we've done work with menthol, and we are extending this to a lot of other flavors, that flavors work by actually having pharmacological effects. They reduce the sensory irritant response from high dose nicotine, and they also improve the taste of e-liquids. And they can sometimes do this at very low levels. This is a human e-cigarette exposure paradigm where we expose people to low and high dose menthols, and you can see that even at the very low dose of menthol, people reported really liking the taste of e-cigarettes. So there's work that needs to be done to determine what is the level of some of these flavorant chemicals that is okay to be included in these e-cigarettes, which might support smoking cessation in smokers, but may not necessarily be attract youth to using these products. Youth also believe that ads for flavored e-liquids target individuals their age and not older adults. This is work done by Bonnie Halpern-Felcher in Stanford, and this data clearly indicate that youth really feel that the flavored e-liquid ads which exist on the market are meant for them and not for older adults. In fact, they say things like, my parents do not like flavors. So their perception is that flavored ads are targeted to them. And we have actually shown using fMRI work that when you look at young adults, flavor ads actually activate the brain reward circuitry, and also flavor ads interfere with retention of health warnings on cigarettes. So again, presence of flavored ads is concerned, presence of the actual flavor itself in the product is of concern. So there's a variety of ways that flavors can alter and appeal for these products. And I like to show people this slide from my friend Brian King, who basically said that advertising, kind of brings the horse or the youth to the water. Flavors make it actually drink the water. And but what keeps them coming back is the nicotine. I'm sure I did not do a good job of stating that as well as Brian does, but I thought this was a very key explanation for why youth start e-cigarette use. The other issue, which is very important, and I'll go through this quickly because I know I'm over my time, is nicotine and addiction. We know that kids use a lot of nicotine concentrations in their e-cigarettes, and that kids are very aware of the nicotine concentrations in their e-cigarettes. This is all published data. Initially, the thought was that maybe kids did not know that there was nicotine in e-cigarettes, but now we know that they are very aware of it. The newer nicotine products, as I said, the pod products contain nicotine salts. Most nicotine in cigarettes is usually freebase nicotine. The use of the salts in products like Juul and other pod devices has raised concerns because nicotine salts are easier to inhale, so they do not produce that kind of toxic response that you get when you inhale freebase nicotine. The irritancy is reduced. And so the concern is that perhaps this is one of the reasons why youth are able to use these products more easily, because they are much easier to use. This is some data that we have from our group on use of Juuls and why kids like Juuls. And I just want to highlight this issue. The top 3 reasons for liking Juul among current Juul users was it gave me a buzz, I like the flavors, and my friends use it. And the reason I want to point this out to you is because I think kids are very aware of the buzz they get from nicotine. And when we look, in fact, at frequency of Juul use, we find that this effect or buzz from nicotine is one of the top reasons that is linked to frequency of Juul use amongst current e-cigarette users. And the final part of my talk, I want to talk about very briefly about some alternative use behaviors that appeal to youth. Some things that kids use e-cigarettes for and they are not meant for. And this is important to understand because a lot of the standardization that's being done by the FDA is with standard products. So they're not looking at other alternative use behaviors of these products. Kids use these products a lot for vaping tricks and for dripping. These are some rates that we obtained in 2017, dripping rates. And kids also use these products for cannabis use. I know we have a number of people on the call who are experts in this use behavior. And I really feel that the use of these products has allowed kids to extend, has allowed kids to use devices for cannabis use a lot more. A lot of these devices are very similar to cannabis devices, but they were only available in states where there was regulation of these products, and they were being sold through shops specifically related to use of these products. But I think with the use of these devices now, kids now are hacking these devices and using them for introducing cannabis instead of nicotine into these devices. So this is another thing that we need to be concerned about. And I was just going to end with some thoughts on how we could regulate these products, but I'll save these for the discussion. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides and hand it over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, I might just have Scott go next, and then we'll reserve questions to the end. Is that okay with you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. So next on is Dr. Scott Hunter, LA County Department of Mental Health. He is a fellow child psychiatrist, a very rare bird where he's triple board general addiction and child and adolescent psychiatry. He's also an active member of the American Academy of Adolescent Psychiatry, the Substance Use Disorder Committee. So without further ado, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Dr. Krishnan, for your presentation. Really great overview, and I'll touch on and hope to extend some of the issues you raised. Just want to thank you, Geeta, for the invitation. It's really an honor to speak with many of you that are here today and share with you a bit, where my focus will really be on how am I and how are we in LA County, for example, using the information that we have both from a policy standpoint in our efforts and in our clinical efforts for prevention, how we're guiding community organizations, schools, et cetera, to work with youth, the ways we counsel youth, counsel parents, and then what we're doing in addition when we're working with youth who are looking to, or who either are compelled to, or maybe are looking to modify their use of e-cigarettes. So let me pull up my presentation here. So, and I'll talk about, kind of design this to be short. So I'm not, hopefully we'll get to some discussion, but there's obviously a lot to say about prevention and even kind of treatment modalities like pharmacotherapies. And I will be discussing using medications that are not FDA approved for the treatment in youth, and then also other non-FDA approved treatments as well. I think highlighting an additional area of need for continued research. So let's see, there we go. So first of all, initiation and cessation when you're thinking about prevention. From the National Academy of Sciences medicine report in 2018 that there's substantial evidence that e-cigarettes increase the risk of ever using combustible tobacco cigarettes among youth and young adults. That's fairly well established. It's interesting, of course, because when you're working with a 14-year-old or 15-year-old, that doesn't carry much weight. I think there's a broad perception among many users of e-cigarettes, particularly younger ones, that cigarettes are gross and that this is completely different. even if there's some recognition of some health risks, which is, another issue entirely. It's often, they're generally, of course, often seen as safer, and then that interpretation of safer then leads to sort of this thought that it might be safe. Whereas, when you're thinking about from a policy standpoint, what would be the benefit of reducing access or reducing sort of early onset of youth, keeping in mind that that is who goes on to use later. Even if you're just talking about cigarettes, never mind what the potential risk for using other substances might be with early exposure to nicotine. There's a large meta-analysis that reported a pooled odds ratio for subsequent cigarette smoking for adolescent onset nicotine use or e-cigarette use was 3.5. So T21 is just a reference to the prevention, or rather the advocacy efforts around pushing for an increase in the legal age to purchase tobacco products, which would include e-cigarette products, e-juices, all associated products. Was in fact successful, and now federally, as of December 20th, 2019, the national age for purchasing tobacco products is 21. I just wanted to briefly comment on where some of the what some of the work that had led to that kind of was pointing to, because I think it really emphasizes how important that kind of this kind of policy change is. First recognizing, as I mentioned before, that 95% of adult smokers begin smoking regularly before age 21. So while many people will start smoking as teenagers, fewer have started smoking on a regular basis by 18. But by age 21, the overwhelming majority, nearly all adult smokers have already begun their regular use of cigarettes. And so anything that can be done to even limit access, even to a small degree, is likely to have a significant impact. As you see in the data I have there, a projection, if the age were raised to 21, and this projection was made in 2015, that for those born between 2000 and 2019, when they were adults, they would experience 223,000 fewer premature deaths, 50,000 fewer deaths from lung cancer in that population, and 4.2 million fewer years of life lost. And so from a public health standpoint, those are pretty extraordinary numbers. So it's a very good thing what's happened. It's perhaps another question about the efficacy of enforcement, and I think that also pertains specifically to e-cigarettes, which are easy to sell, easy to purchase. They're the e-juice variety places to get e-juice from online to various shops is so large that it's really quite difficult, I think, to enforce the 21 laws. And then once you have the device, how difficult it is for community organizations like schools to identify who's using, because of how easy the devices are to conceal. This is really just repetition of the extent of the crisis that Dr. Krishnan already shared. Looking as recently as 2019 among youth, you're looking at 1 million reported daily users of e-cigarettes, and sort of a large preference for flavored products. I want to talk a little bit about marketing, because that has, I think, a very large part to do with the increase in popularity, and then also sort of the difficulty perhaps in changing some of the rates of use. Where 7 in 10 teens were exposed to cigarette advertisements in 2016. Many of those are coming in retail stores, although also a very large number online. The television ads for e-cigarettes have significantly declined in the last several months. Sort of beginning with Juul had a large ad campaign, but voluntarily withdrew that around the time that we were seeing the e-cigarette and vaping associated lung injury crisis in the fall, and the 20% in newspapers and magazines. And I have a little note there right by the online exposures that indicating that artificial intelligence features within a lot of the most common social media apps, Instagram, Snapchat, for example. To use Instagram as an example, for those of you that aren't familiar, in addition to the friends that you follow, that you see kind of in your feed, there's another tab you can click on that is called Explore. And your Explore tab essentially uses the information from things that you've liked in the past, or things that you've even spent time viewing in the past, to give you suggested content from the public sphere. And so what can happen is sort of was shown in this study here from 2018, was published in 2018. They looked at Instagram public images from over a 12-month period, and they were filtering for tags commonly associated with smoking, with any kind of smoking. So it wasn't specifically e-cigarettes, but also included combustible cigarettes. And they identified in that time period, they captured approximately 2 million images. They randomly sampled 8,000 of them, and then coded them. The only data I reported here from that is that, it's probably no surprise that only a small minority were anti-smoking in any way. Just over a third were specifically related to e-cigarettes, and again, this is 2014, 2015, and so my experience is that that's changed, that's most likely shifted to see a lot more e-cigarette content, and it's not just Dr. Krishnan mentioned the popularity of vape tricks, which of course draws I think a lot of people to a kind of community or sort of like a hobbyist type of engagement with these products, but it's also even just kind of more more typical users, like looking cool. There were some reports, of course, of also the e-cigarette companies paying influencers to post this content, right? So it's really not these are not paid advertisements you're talking about. You're not seeing kind of slick ad content from manufacturers, but you're just seeing people sharing themselves smoking, looking cool, etc. This particular study has identified that the overwhelming majority of these posts were young single white women, and single meaning they were alone in the photo, sort of often using the products in a way sort of meant to kind of look cool. And then even among friends, you'll see in smaller groups, kind of perhaps inspired by these kinds of images, you see a kind of trading of these images among one another. And we see that a lot clinically when parents are monitoring social media. They'll report kind of finding these images on their children's phones. I think just to go back to that for a second, the e-cigarettes and what we're seeing in LA County as well, in the justice system, in the juvenile justice system, where I do a lot of clinical work, there really has been an explosion of the e-cigarette products. Much of that is associated with the use of THC or cannabis, and that's really getting at a couple things. One, the cost of these devices is also coming down. I think that while this has been looked at sort of more common among more affluent populations, I fully expect that will change, though there's of course more to be seen. There's more to be looked at in that area as far as additional research that would be helpful in sort of what are the patterns of change as far as who's accessing these devices and their prevalence of use among different populations. So, thinking about our clinical approaches to patients like this, and particularly thinking about youth, where we're generally starting is quantifying nicotine consumption. And I think that this is useful, not just for understanding kind of like what level they might be exposed to as far as treatment planning, but it usually does a lot as far as helping youth understand what the quantity which they're consuming, because the overwhelming majority, in my experience, have no idea. And the way you go through this, and it's surprising, it's not it's not very simple, it's not very straightforward. These kinds of quantities aren't clearly advertised, aren't clearly labeled. So just to give you some examples, like if you have a youth who's using a tank or a mod device, which has been shown to you, they've got a canister of juice, or like a bottle of juice that they refill a tank with. And so they'll go buy a bottle of juice, in their preferred flavor, and their preferred strength. And it might be advertised as 30 milligrams, although, I've put here 30 milligrams per milliliter. They don't say that on the bottle. They simply say 30 milligrams. And, it's easy to imagine that that's maybe what's contained in the entire bottle, not per milliliter. But these bottles are sort of usually contain, several milliliters, if not dozens. And, they also sometimes report as a percent, so say 5% or 3%, or if you're buying like a sealed pod, like the Juul product, it's available in a 5% or a 3%. And then how does the youth sort of easily, take that and sort of understand what quantity of nicotine they're using? Most pods, that sort of fillable devices, are 1.5 to 2.0 milliliters. But even that is another thing to know. And then how much do you fill it all the way? Do you fill it part way? And then from that, how much nicotine you're using. So just as an example of one youth I worked with recently, he was using 50 milligram juice and refilling a 2 milliliter pod every 1.5 to 2 days, which means he's consuming approximately 50 to 75 milligrams of nicotine per day. And then where I usually go from there is an explanation of, okay, well, how many cigarettes would that be equivalent to? And if you're using the data that people are consuming just over 1 milligram of nicotine per cigarette, and then you say, okay, so if you were smoking cigarettes, the amount of cigarettes you'd be smoking to achieve the same amount of nicotine you're getting on a daily basis is 2.5 to 4 packs of cigarettes. And that's usually kind of a somewhat of a realization for young people, even if they have limited interest in quitting. And it's usually a good place to start. I think it's also helpful to understand why some of these cases where youth are even motivated to stop using e-cigarettes and yet find that it's extremely difficult to do so. You're typically dealing with larger amounts of nicotine sort of used at increasing rates throughout the day in order to maintain a buzz that really changes the profile of the pharmacokinetics of nicotine, of their sort of pharmacokinetic profile in a given day, that you're then having to combat when you're talking about managing cravings, whether you're doing that behaviorally or with medication. From there, just going through the list of questions associated with substance use disorder, like in the DSM-5, and taking a Socratic approach to understand a youth's use, even is kind of already taking that initial step of providing them with education about what the role of addiction might be in their life. And another thing that has been helpful as far as trying to figure out how do we operationalize use behaviors in a way that's then useful both clinically and for research purposes is there's the when you're talking about combustible cigarettes and you're looking at something like a Fagerstrom test, which is a measure of sort of the severity of someone's nicotine addiction or nicotine use, and then using that to model how you might want to intervene. We don't have those kinds of protocols for e-cigarettes. And one of the things that has come out, in a study recently is that, is if you're asking people about how many sessions or, kind of instances in which they're using, a session being kind of like a time of using, per month, or, which is usually calculated from sessions per day and days per month, all of those measures are found to correlate very strongly with blood cotinine levels. Some of the more complicated tools that are like adaptations of the Fagerstrom test for e-cigarettes, like it might be like a 10-question survey that gets at some of these same questions. How many times you're using per day, how much you usually use, how long from the time that you wake up to use, do you ever wake up in the middle of the night to use? Those correlate as well, and they might provide you sort of additional detailed information. But at the same time, what's been found in this recent study was the strongest association with cotinine levels was the sessions per month, closely followed by days per month of use, which is a very nimble and useful clinical tool or clinical question to ask. Because many of the youth we're working with that are using or whose parents are bringing them into clinic are younger, and generally even younger than 16, and also for older youth and young adults, you're starting with behavioral treatments, and throughout the process, as I've kind of hopefully already been alluding to, you're using motivational interviewing strategies, really kind of approaching with a curiosity and trying to understand what the existing level of knowledge is. There are a lot of casual users who may not have a lot of knowledge, and oftentimes a clear explanation from someone who they may see as having some expertise can go a long way. We also know that that's particularly true, or it's likely to be particularly true for youth who have not started using, but also have not yet made up their mind about whether they're going to use, and those are likely, that is likely the most effective group at providing these kinds of educations. I have a colleague who's working on school-based interventions, and has demonstrated efficacy of really quite simple brief interventions as far as really shifting people's attitudes to stating, to when they describe their openness about ever trying e-cigarettes. Parent coaching are very important, and environmental modifications. And one of the things I think I was alluding to in that environmental modifications, particularly for younger teens, is helping parents understand where they might be having exposure, like in social media, Snapchat, Instagram, and then having parents think about how they're regulating and monitoring their youth social media use, as it can significantly change what they're exposed to and what they might be thinking about and drawn to. So in motivational interviewing process, this is where the teaching on the effects of nicotine and harmful ingredients happens. It's done most effectively when you're asking youth for feedback after they're getting new information, and when you're giving them bite-sized pieces of that information, which is also often a good way to teach parents to give their youth feedback, rather than sitting them down for lengthy lectures, teaching parents to provide this kind of information. Advising youth who have some motivation to quit to get, find other ways to engage digitally with, in lieu of maybe like a group support and that sort of thing. So, for example, here's an app that was produced out of the University of California, San Diego, called No Vape. It's completely free. It offers, a quit coach kind of within the app. There are games within the app, and it's the kind of thing that you can mention youth to use, but it's really actually most useful if you sit there with them while they download it on their phones and get into it, and you can work with them to put their goals and their treatment plan in the app, and then it becomes a very useful clinical tool as far as monitoring their use as well. There are lots of really great resources out there, including smokefree.gov, which has as you can see from this screenshot, smoke-free text, another app, speaking live to an expert, and that this is kind of really an alternative to Quitline, which have been around for a lot longer, and have shown to be just as effective at providing that crucial behavioral element to treating nicotine use disorders, including with e-cigarettes. There's another site, the Surgeon General report on e-cigarettes, which has really nicely done information for parents that they can go to, sort of educating youth on business trends, helping them understand kind of where some of the drive to get youth using might be coming from, which usually speaks to their sense of fairness and justice in a way that can be useful to look at. And briefly, I just wanted to include this slide and what this tracks, sort of coming back to what I was talking about before about thinking about what kind of nicotine youth are consuming. This looks at some of the historical. It kind of, if you go from left to right and then top to bottom, it shows you sort of some of the historical trends in nicotine pharmacokinetics with the devices as they have changed over time. You look at the cigarette, and one thing that I'll say is confusing, of course, about these graphs is that the time scale is not the same. So you have to take a step back and sort of look and think about what they mean. But you're looking at 2 hours of cigarette use, the approximate half-life of nicotine for that first image, and noticing that high peak that you get from the nicotine from a cigarette. And that early versions of e-cigarettes that you see in the next two graphs didn't really replicate that, and were sort of really a much lower kind of sustained exposure to nicotine and not really providing that initial kind of peak. That changed with the closed tank systems. You see that the time scale is extended and sort of, or excuse me, rather with the later devices. Even with the closed tank systems that were kind of the early versions of the tanks, you weren't quite getting it. But then with the open tank systems and then with the box mods, and I think, and like you're seeing with the quantity of nicotine, or of aerosol you're able to consume with the salts, as Dr. Krishnan was talking about, really have approximated the nicotine kind of nicotine buzz, or sort of the initial rapid nicotine onset, the rapid approaching Cmax for nicotine consumption. And then the other thing that's striking about this is, the blue area of each of these graphs indicates the amount of time that the device is being used. And this is what you see also in practice that's very different from smoking cigarettes. Sort of what would be the equivalent of like chain smoking cigarettes is actually a very common way to use the vaporizers. They typically don't feel so harsh on the throat. There's much less of a kind of a comfort disincentive to use them in this kind of like sort of successive way, which of course leads to increasing levels of nicotine. And that makes sense as well. As you sort of continue to try to chase the effects of nicotine, you might want to use more and more and more in a given session. And this is where, thinking about it in this way also highlights for me why sometimes, one of the approaches to helping people reduce their nicotine use, which through e-cigarettes, which deserves more study, is sort of, having, coaching people on purchasing e-juice that has a lower nicotine content. When you're doing that, being really careful about monitoring how they're using it, because they may very well make subtle changes, and even in how they inhale, that can change sort of how much nicotine they're getting from a particular draw. So, sort of running out of time, so kind of, and I intended to kind of go through these very quickly too, but I have on here the FDA approved pharmacotherapies for smoking cessation for adults. None of these are FDA approved in youth. There's some data out there of their efficacy, but it's not extensive data. And in older youth particularly, we'll use these throughout our clinics when indicated, and when behavioral treatments alone have not worked. The nicotine replacement, I find there are some youth for whom that doesn't work, and there are case reports out there of using multiple patches rather than just like one nicotine patch. But there's not real sort of strong support for anything like that. The combination NRT is rather than kind of like a second line approach, I think is often a good place to start, because it provides you that sort of baseline level of nicotine with those additional peaks. And in combination NRT, of course, referring to someone who has like a patch and then has a gum or a lozenge to add in addition. In the interest of time, I'll sort of run through these very quickly. I want to comment on that other combinations of the FDA-approved medications, that cytosine, which has been used in Eastern Europe for decades, and is also just like varenicline is a partial agonist at the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, is also something that we don't have as a tool in the United States, though hopefully that will change in the future. Other medications, nortriptyline and clonidine, they use this second line that very well may just kind of touch on the anxiety that's associated with withdrawal. Unwilling participants when it comes to pharmacotherapy, there's some data out there that suggests that there may still be some value in pharmacotherapy. There's a large group of COPD patients that weren't ready to quit, but were all given varenicline, and within 18 months, most of them had quit. Gradual reduction in combustible cigarettes is shown to have similar quit rates to people who sort of quit altogether, and that's not clear if that would translate to e-cigarettes or not. Other medications that are being looked at, there was some interest in lorcaserin, which was FDA approved as a weight loss medication, though that was withdrawn in February due to a concern for increased cancer risk. there was some data to indicate that used following varenicline or in addition to varenicline was improving cessation rates. Though that, of course, has now become quite problematic. Just a list of some other medications that have been looked at, but of course, none of these have sufficient evidence to really support their use, and nor are they FDA indicated.
It's 12 noon, so wrap up, Scott.
Yep, this is my last slide. And the so I just want to end with the American Association of Pediatrics public policy recommendations, and essentially kind of what additional research is needed. But we're looking to track and evaluate e-cigarette use, and prevention strategies in middle school, high school, and college campuses where we know e-cigarette use is propagating. Understanding how the policy and regulatory enforcement strategies affect use, as I mentioned earlier, and then looking at tobacco control messaging and developing treatment strategies that are specific to e-cigarettes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's so much to present and discuss, and I know that 1 hour is not sufficient for both talks, but both of you did such a wonderful job. Thank you very much. I noticed that it's 12 noon, so I was wondering, if presenters would like to stay on for a few extra moments, and those of you who have questions for them, you may want to ask those questions, if that is okay with all of you. Happy to extend this by another 10 minutes so that we can cover some questions and discussions.
Yep, sorry to run over, and yes, I'm available. I can stay on.
Thank you.
Hi, Scott. I have a question. Do I understand correctly that with some of the e-cigarettes, the nicotine blood levels are likely to be higher than with regular cigarettes? And the reason for that is that like the box e-cigarette is likely to be used more frequently than a regular cigarette.
Yes, that's absolutely the case. As far as the frequency of use, like you could see in some of that pharmacokinetic data I was showing, there's a longer period of use of those devices. I'm a little less familiar with what's happening in the first few minutes of use, although you've seen that that's changed too with the change in the technology. Early devices not really creating that strong early peak of nicotine blood concentrations that is now being replicated, very much so, and likely even exceeded with some of the devices and the way people are using them. The mods, right, and the reason they're called that is they were kind of an evolution of what the of what people were doing, building their own devices early on, where they could adjust the battery power and the amount of nicotine exposed to the coil and that sort of thing, and that's what they can do, right? They're modifiable. You can turn them up, you can turn them down, and then add that to the vapor, the liquid you're using can have different concentrations, up to 72 milligrams per milliliter. It's the highest I've seen, and that I fully expect you'd be achieving higher blood concentrations in a faster amount of time than we would with traditional cigarettes.
Excellent presentations, both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Are there others with questions? Do you have questions for each other, maybe? So I have a question. I know that these presentations were focused on nicotine for the most part, but any concerns about marijuana, vaping, and the overlap between these two? Is there a chicken and egg issue here? Either of you or both of you could respond.
Sure, I'll take a quick stab at it, Geeta. Absolutely. As I said in my talk, the devices that I use for marijuana vaping are very similar looking to the devices that I used for nicotine vaping. That's one thing to keep in mind, but I think what's happening with the kids, and we have some new data to show this, is that they're actually using the nicotine devices and introducing marijuana into them. So they can actually open up these devices, both the pods as well as the e-liquids. They know how to hack them. and they introduce, they put in marijuana, THC, they put in, oils, they put in the actual leaves, and they use the devices for vaping marijuana. So we are seeing increases in that also. There's a huge overlap between the two.
Yeah, I mean, we see it clinic all the time, and I think it'll be very, I'd be interested to see, as we learn more about patterns, whether it's, introducing others who wouldn't otherwise be exposed to marijuana. I fully expect that that's the case. I think that the way the devices float around schools or, juvenile detention settings, for example, where sort of I see it in particular, you're definitely having youth exposed who might not otherwise be, and the devices are very similar. I think it would even be easy to use a device, unwittingly, to some degree. I think, but I think that there's clearly real risk there.
Thank you. Any other questions? I don't see any questions on the chat screen either. All right. Well, thank you very much for staying over a little bit, and tremendous presentations. Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing your work at future meetings. Thank you.
Thanks, Geeta.
Thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.